Hello, everyone. This is Rob Orson with Emerging Revolutionary War. Welcome back to one of our Rev War revelries. And tonight we're continuing our series on the 250th anniversary leading up to the American Revolution. We've done lots of different podcasts and videos on the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre many years ago, and just kind of covering all the events leading up to April 19th, 1775. And tonight is a really special treat because we're going to talk about an event that really could have been the shot heard around the world. And I'm very happy to have Dr. Cynthia Hatch with us tonight. She's with Oklahoma State University Institute of Technology and has a PhD from Liberty here in Virginia and has read a lot about the events around Fort William and Mary. So, Dr. Hatch, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we're going to just dive right on in because this is something I've been very excited about doing because Fort William and Mary, when I was researching my book on Lexington and Concord, it was really a fascinating story, but not a lot of places to read about it. And I'm glad I got connected with Dr. Hatch here, who can hopefully share some more information about the events that happened up in New Hampshire. So let's before we talk about December 14th, 1774, kind of set the stage in what's going on in New Hampshire. We all know about the leaders in Massachusetts, the Sam Adams, the Warrens, but who are the people in charge in New Hampshire, and who are the leaders that some of these Whigs are kind of leading these efforts to oppose British rule?
So, the leadership in New Hampshire at this time, if you go to 1774, it's going to be Governor John Wentworth. Yeah, he is the nephew of the previous governor. So, you've kind of got the Wentworth oligarchy there in New Hampshire, pretty much running things for most of the 18th century, early 18th century. Very powerful family, very well connected. Basically, all of the Wentworths have married into other families, and all of those families then are in power in some fashion. Um, if you take Chief Justice Theodore Atkinson, he actually was basically like the right hand man of John Wentworth as well as Benning Wentworth. He married Hannah Wentworth, which was Benning's sister. And, that kind of tells you a little bit about the shape of the way that politics are running in New Hampshire. At that point in time, 1774, there's a slow burn. Things are not completely, it's not necessarily like in Boston where things are really contentious right off the bat, but things are definitely underneath the surface. Things are starting to move. Um, if you go back even further, there's a 1711 passage of the White Pine Act. That was something that was it was an act basically in terms of the lumber that was being harvested there in New Hampshire. Basically, who had pick of the lumber, right? So fast forward to 1772, you have private mills who are harvesting all of this lumber. Well, the lumber then is being used for ship masts. Well, the king then has the first pick of all of the best timber, in regards not only of that mill but all over. So, when you're looking at kind of the push and pull of power in New Hampshire, there starts to be questions about, well, why is this happening? How did this happen? Or how is it possible that the king, thousands of miles away, is going to dictate what we do on our own land? We're different. We have our own land. This is ours. So there's a little bit of there starts to be some questions. And I had just mentioned to you before we started filming, there was a 1772 Pine Tree riot that
Mhm.
happened. And that was really setting the stage for what I think happens with Fort William and Mary just a couple of years later. So this is spring of 1772. You've got a lumber mill owned by Ebenezer Mudgett, and they actually just recently had their 250th commemoration of this event as well. What ends up happening is, the sheriff and the deputy, they ride into Ware, New Hampshire, to serve a warrant for Ebenezer Mudgett for basically, absconding with the timber. They meet in the Pine Tree Inn, and that night, a whole bunch of guys bust in on the sheriff and the deputy and beat them within an inch of their life.
Hmm.
They crop the horse's ears, so the horses are bloodied. They end up riding away. They've been beaten with, basically like an inch of their life, and they ride to try to find some help. Well, by the time they get back, everybody is, conveniently not there. So there's really nothing to do. Well, the court case happens to where Theodore Atkinson is involved in it. He's the chief justice, and as I mentioned, he's also a family relation of the Wentworths. So as this court case proceeds, what you end up having is um, they're not charged with stealing the wood, right? Which is basically what the warrant was there for initially. They're charged for assault on the sheriff and the deputy, and all things being equal, you would assume that that's a pretty hefty penalty for that. And what ends up happening is the people who are named in the court case are fined 20 shillings. That to me is absolutely wild. So there's a lack of legal recourse in the courts at this time, being led by basically one of Wentworth's right-hand men. So as we look at that particular instance, and then you fast forward, so this is spring of 1772. Roughly 6 to 8 weeks later, you have the burning of the HMS Gaspee in Rhode Island, and that doesn't get prosecuted, right? So everybody
Right.
kind of is hush about that. And then, about a year and a half later or so, then you have the seizure of Fort William and Mary, and it's this kind of slow burning. But if you actually do something against the crown, are you actually going to be,
Hmm.
is there going to be any repercussions? Is there going to be any penalties? I think that there's justification to say that that would be questionable. All things being equal, does it seem like the justice system is a little wonky at that time in New Hampshire and maybe even Rhode Island? Yeah, I think that's safe to say. So when you start getting into what's going on in New Hampshire specifically, you have a very powerful group of people who, and I don't know if it's a case to where are they not being straightforward with how bad things are getting with Governor Wentworth, or is it Wentworth isn't acknowledging how bad things actually are, and in terms of being able to be flared up fairly quickly into a riot or a revolt, or in this case, the seizure of the fort. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can interpret what Wentworth and his I mean, it's almost like he set up a little mini court there, like a royal court there in New Hampshire. But what he and his men are essentially doing. So I think there's a lot of interesting intersects there.
Well, it's always interesting to me too, when you look at all the governors in the colonies, how very few of them were well prepared for what took place, right?
Right.
All of them, I don't think, expected, and maybe they just had blinders on. We can, you spend all day talking about each governor specifically, but I think each of them, looking back now, really didn't expect, obviously, what happened up in New Hampshire, what happened in Boston. I think they were very just kind of shocked by, which means maybe they were just a little obtuse to what was happening in their own constituents, right? Maybe they didn't have a good idea of what the
Yeah.
what the public was thinking about how things were transpiring. What were the connections between the leaders in New Hampshire and Boston? Because we know about the Boston Tea Party happens, and then we fast forward, they got the Salem alarm, not Salem alarm, sorry, the power alarm in September 74. These events have to be getting sent up to New Hampshire. What's New Hampshire's reaction to the closure of the Boston port and all the events that happened just after that?
So pretty quickly in 1772, 1773, even what will end up being revolutionary leaders like John Sullivan. John Sullivan was pretty tight with Governor Wentworth. Until that point, they were pretty well, they worked together. There was some sort of, it was more than just civility. It seemed like that there was actually a little bit more of like friendship involved, in a business sense. Um, at that point, though, there seems to be a real divergence between what's going on in the colonies surrounding them and what happens personally, because a lot of these relationships end up getting fractured and they start going their separate ways. By the time you get into the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773 and the reaction of the coercive acts, the intolerable acts, as we know them, there's those lines are being drawn pretty definitely in terms of the way that they're looking at it. And and I don't know if Governor Wentworth. So, okay, let me back up two things. Governor Wentworth was the nephew of Benning Wentworth. Benning Wentworth had been a governor of New Hampshire for quite a long time. Um, this is not a situation to where John Wentworth, the nephew, was well prepared and he was placed in that position because of merit, right? I mean, he was just there because of family connection. So by the time you get into a lot of these issues that are happening, like the Boston Tea Party, the coercive acts, and so forth, he's not well prepared, like we had just mentioned, to be able to deal with these things. There's not a well to draw from that he has to be able to say, okay, well, when your constituents are unhappy, here's how to maybe rectify it. That just didn't exist. And I also don't know how much people were really being straightforward with what the reality was going on, also outside of New Hampshire. It's important to recognize, too, that communication, while it is obviously not as fast as it is today with us, it traveled fairly decently fast.
Mhm.
I mean, you could get a writing dispatch pretty, within a day. So, I mean, these things were moving in terms of the information flow pretty quick, for people to be able to kind of get a gauge on what was happening outside of New Hampshire.
Yeah, it's always amazing to learn about the writers, not just the famous ones on April 18th, 19th, but leading up to that, right? And we'll probably talk about Paul Revere shortly. But it is amazing, like when we talk about what happens leading up to April, how interconnected these colonies are and getting information back and forth. And I think that's another thing that these governors kind of lacked, no knowledge of how quickly these colonies were working together. Of course, this is after the First Continental Congress, which,
Mhm.
accomplished a few small things, but I think most of what accomplished there was making contacts among all these people who knew of each other, but not necessarily knew each other. And once they meet in Philadelphia in the fall, then they got names, faces to names, and there's a connection there. Um, what's the British presence in New Hampshire in '74? I think that is important to talk about a little bit as we get into what happens at Fort William and Mary. Like, what is the British presence in the colony at that time? And was it something that you think Great Britain should have spent more attention on?
Yeah, the British presence, while it was there, it was nothing like what was going on in Massachusetts and even some of the other colonies. Um, for instance, the the general setup at Fort William and Mary was the captain and five other soldiers to defend the fort.
Right.
That is not a well defended fort, right? I
No.
mean, that in no way, shape, or form does that make a well defended fort. So I think that there's a lack of British acknowledgement about not only the physical location of Fort William and Mary. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with exactly where this is, it's an island, right off of Portsmouth. But I mean, like, you have to want to get there. And the fort itself is off on like a little peninsula, right in the river. So I mean, it's strategically it's really well placed. But again, you have to want to get there. This is not just a case that you're going to stumble across it. So I think that the British, they did themselves a disservice by not, bolstering the forces there and having more of a presence. I think that kind of leads to, I think it leads to the people of New Hampshire kind of feeling like they're not around. So basically, it's not a problem for us too much. Not to say that there was no presence. There was, but again, it's not like it's happening in Boston. But I think that there's also just a lack of British acknowledgement that there's a problem in New Hampshire that's brewing, and that they really didn't understand it.
Right. And so we have Gage trying to pull in, getting word of this militarization of the different communities around Boston, New England in general, not just Boston, because we're talking about New Hampshire tonight. But as we look at what Gage is trying to accomplish here, Salem Alarm happens in September '74. He's trying to get the powder. What draws the Gage's trying to think how to phrase this, but what draws his attention to William and Mary? Is it the powder that's stored there? And what perceived threat does he think exists in New Hampshire for him to want to seize the powder?
I think he must see something that Governor Wentworth doesn't. I think had Governor Wentworth actually understood the the risk that was posed, there would have been more of a force at the fort. But I think when you start seeing, um, this movement towards the fort to secure powder to basically keep it from getting in the hands of the Patriots, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the people in New Hampshire it is a powder keg waiting to erupt. It's just it hasn't yet. And I think that there's that acknowledgement that hasn't been made by Governor Wentworth or his men really that's lacking. Had they actually acknowledged it and fortified the fort better, I don't think you would have seen 400 men show up on boats and abscond with all the powder and the cannons and everything else. So I think Gates must see something that, or Gage must see something that isn't necessarily seen by the authority on ground in New Hampshire.
Right. And he obviously Gates knew about what happened in, outside of Boston with the fire alarm. So I guess talk about a little bit about Gage's his plan to get British forces up there. I think a lot of people who don't know about this story don't know that there was an interest by the British in Boston to get to New Hampshire and get this powder. So what is his plan, and how does it how does it play out as far as leading up to the events in December 14th?
Well, one of the things that struck me as a pivotal moment was the December 5th reporting from the New Hampshire Gazette that states there is a frigate, a man of war, and several other ships en route with 500 Marines on each ship, ready to go to the fort. I think that statement, that reporting, set in motion several different things because the Committee of Correspondence was already meeting down in New Hampshire, or not New Hampshire, Massachusetts, when they wrote the letter that will eventually be dispatched. But I think at that point, I think you're seeing kind of the Fort William and Mary being triangulated in a sense that there's a lot of effort. They know it's weakly defended. They know that there's movement of potential troops coming in, and then you also have a faction of the people of New Hampshire who, it's pretty quickly it's moving in a direction to where they are aligning themselves clearly with the patriot cause. So all of these things together, you start noticing how pretty quickly Gage is like, okay, we need to make a move here because if we don't, other things are going to, proceed in correspondence with how things are going with this particular fort, and all the ammunition is going to be gone. And I think, eventually we do end up seeing that.
So much like the communities outside Boston, did people in New Hampshire, they believe this is their powder? You see that argument a lot, like,
Yeah.
it's the king's powder. No, it's our powder. I mean, is there a basis for doing this because the colony owns the powder, the militia owns the powder, or is it because they're trying to actually steal the king's powder? I mean, what's your perception of what they thought of who the powder belonged to?
Yeah, I think it could kind of be a little bit of twofold. One, I think that they're seeing the crown be overzealous in terms of their actions towards the colonies, and it's a little bit of a gotcha kind of situation. I also think that there's a good portion of it that um, really they believe that that is their powder, that is their fort, that's on their colony. They own it. I mean, that is encompassing all of what they, meaning New Hampshire, consists of. Much like when you look at, if you go back to the pine tree riot, those timbers, those were their timbers. It wasn't the crown. It wasn't, someone else's. It was theirs. It's the same kind of idea, just transported in the idea of a fort and the ammunitions that go along with it. These were their ammunitions. Basically, the crown didn't have any right to come in there and take them because, and again, it's something interesting to remember too. Most of these men had already fought together, in the French and Indian War. There was already some sort of knowledge about, tactical behaviors and, who fought with who and relationships and things like that. That had already existed. So now you put that in a position to where sides are being drawn in terms of, whether you're, a loyalist or whether you're going to be a patriot. And those issues really kind of line up. And that fort is exactly where we end up seeing how that shakes out.
Right. So let's get to the heart of the matter here. So why do the Whigs, the Patriots there in New Hampshire pick this December date? How do they get word of what the British are supposedly planning?
Okay, so this is the infamous Jerry letter. This is John Jerry. This is Elderbridge Jerry, his brother, writes a letter, and in it he's saying that basically, I'll paraphrase for you because it's a little bit long. They're coming for the powder. we need to take it and we need to do it now. If we don't do it now, our cause is going to be lost. This letter is then given to Paul Revere, which most people know as Paul Revere's, infamous midnight ride. And this is several months before that. So Paul Revere gets the letter. He rides up to New Hampshire. He meets John Langdon and Samuel Cutts and the Committee of Correspondence, the Committee of 45, and he gives them the letter. And it's, this is what's happening. We need to do something. Okay, so letter is written the 12th. It's delivered the 13th. They try to get together some sort of quorum of, hey, we need to get people together. It's late in the day and it doesn't happen. What ends up happening is the next morning on the 14th, that's when things really start kind of moving in a direction that there's no turning back. You have, fife and drum going up and down the streets, kind of calling attention to what's going on, gaining support. And at this point in time, too, as they're boarding the boats, these little gondolas, and again, the fort is out there on a little island, and it is December. And that does not mean that it is warm and that you want to be out on the ocean. That's not a good thing. They board these little gondolas, these flat bottom boats. They go out to the island, and on the way out there, they're picking up more and more people who, from areas like Rye and other little towns that are in support of what they're doing. And so they're kind of, it's a whole bunch of them now. They're coming together and they come out there. And what strikes me as fascinating is by the time that they actually reach the fort, Captain Cochrane, who is the captain in charge of the fort at that point, it's like he opens the door and he's already been warned at this point, hey, be aware that there are some things that could be happening. So you need to be on, you need to be on guard. But again, if he had been warned by the governor that he needed to be on guard, why weren't you given more men? That would be my biggest question, because strategically that just doesn't make sense. You don't go defend a fort with a total of 6 people. It just doesn't work that way. So they get to the fort, they greet Captain Cochrane, and Captain Cochrane eventually lets them in to come in by the fire, which again, if you think that there's going to be things that are amiss, why would you allow people into the fort who, in all intents purposes, have never come to visit you before, right? There's kind of, as I'm reading through these depositions about, especially from Captain Cochrane, it's read as though he thought somebody was bringing him, like, hey, we brought you dinner. Let's come in and have a drink together by the fire. And it's so almost blasé about his reaction. And you just kind of think, that doesn't make sense. I don't understand how that happens, how you allow people into the fort and then, and they just keep coming and eventually will swarm the fort and take it over. But that initial interaction between Captain Cochrane and the men from Portsmouth it's mind-boggling, shocking, all of those adjectives, because it just doesn't make sense.
I guess they couldn't hear because they not hear the commotion going on in town, and I mean, I don't know. I mean, just because you hear fife and drum doesn't mean you're about to be, attacked. But it just seems like, you know,
No,
geographically speaking, how far? I know the landscape's changed a lot today, but how far was the fort you think from like the downtown area where this militia was trying to form up?
yeah. I don't know that it would have been close enough to hear anything,
Yeah,
but I would be skeptical that the soldiers on duty wouldn't have heard hundreds of boats in the water
right.
because
It would be
it
weird, right?
yeah,
It
which just
would be.
seems strange. I mean, and it's so strange that so Sarah Cochrane, Captain Cochrane's wife, is there. She lives there at the fort with him. And at one point, she leans over to Captain Cochrane and says, would you like me to get you your pistols? I mean, yes, yeah, that's probably a good idea. That would make sense. So I think the fact that his wife, Sarah, is understanding that there's things that are amiss. These guys are not just coming to have, ale with you by the fire. They're not coming to say goodbye. Um, I, there's just a real disjointedness that happens at that initial meeting. And by the time he finally figures out, yeah, this is a really bad situation. They're coming to storm the fort and they're coming to take everything. I mean, it's too late. I mean, they've got no crew to defend the fort. You have a couple of people who end up showing up trying to help. Um, it doesn't help, not against those kinds of numbers. And, pretty quickly, I think Captain Cochrane comes to the realization that, oh, okay, I'm under siege. This must have been what they were talking about. And then at that point, it's just too late.
So what do they take that first trip into the fort?
Oh, gosh. I mean, the first night they end up taking as much as that they could get onto the boats. So there were things like cannons and muskets and black powder, anything that they could basically get their hands on. They got their hands on that first night. But again, you're talking about small boats. How much
Right.
can you actually handle in those, small flat bottom boats? So that's going to be, you know, was it a misjudgment to bring small boats? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, that's obviously conjecture. But they ended up taking as much as that they possibly could.
Sure. But not all of it because they come back, right?
They do. They come back the next day. Yeah, John Sullivan comes back the next day. John Sullivan takes something like 60 cannons, no, 16 cannons, 60 muskets, and basically anything else that they could, get their hands on at that point. And they leave.
And what's the British
Excuse me.
soldiers' response to all this? The first night, um, since they've kind of let them in the fort, I'm assuming they're told to stand down. They just kind of stand. I mean, what do they do? They stand aside and let this take place?
Um, I think initially there's a little bit of a tussle, but I think pretty quickly they're going to understand that they're so completely outnumbered that there's not much that they can do. Um, they don't. There's not a great big fight that occurs. I know some of the different things that I've read states that there's a big commotion, there's a big fight that takes place. Other readings within the depositions is basically like they just realize the British soldiers realize that there's not a lot that they can do, so they attempt to do the best that they can, which isn't much. They take Captain Cochrane hostage, so to speak, but I mean he ends up obviously living to give a deposition less than a month later.
Mhm.
So I mean it's uneventful in the standpoint that there wasn't, there's not a great loss of life. There's not, a major skirmish. There's no, I mean, the fort doesn't get damaged. I mean, it was already kind of, they say that it was already in a dilapidated state at that point, which probably did not help defend it, really.
Is the same true for the second night too? Is there any more British resistance on the second night now that they know when these people are coming over, they're not coming over for
Not,
supper?
not, no, and yeah, I mean, basically, come on over. No, there's not a great deal of resistance. I think that as they're recognizing that these things are happening, Captain Cochrane is in a state of what options does he have, and he really doesn't have any. There's nobody that they can call. Excuse me. There's no one that they can call for quick reinforcements. So they're basically on their own. And anyone who has attempted to basically help with the British side of it, they're not in any great position to be able to do so. Basically, if someone has shown up, they've shown up with their own ammunition, their own muskets, which is not necessarily a great thing when you're talking about defending a fort over hundreds of people. Excuse me.
Right.
Yeah.
So, um, as we look about how, and we'll talk about this in a second, the reactions on both sides. So, are there any British soldiers that are wounded? Are there any Americans, or I shouldn't say Americans, New Hampshire militiamen that are wounded? Is it pretty much a bloodless? I know you said that there was no really fighting, but is there anyone that's injured or wounded on either side?
There are wounds that exist, just from the standpoint that I mean, like anything trying to overtake a fort, you are going to have some sort of resistance. It was so lacking, though, that I wouldn't say that it was any kind of a battle, so to speak. Um, there, the let's see, there were a couple of the British soldiers who were mildly injured, and then um, most of the New Hampshire militia that were associated with the seizing of the fort, there weren't there weren't great wounds that I can think of, that had been sustained at that point.
The reason why I asked that is because And like I said, we'll talk about this at the very end, but like this is an attack on the king's troops, right? Like
Yes,
this is not like the powder alarm where they go in, they steal the powder, and then they leave, and then the militia shows up, and there's really nothing. There's no really major confrontation. This is why I think it's fascinating. This is an attack on the king's fort, on the king's troops, and which is sets, raises the bar in what's been happening. I mean, you throw some tea in the harbor, I get it, it's important, but I mean, now you're attacking regular British soldiers
right.
in this action. So to me, it's just part of this escalation that you and I were talking about before we went live, is that this is a huge, to me, this is like one of the biggest escalations from Boston Tea Party to Lexington is this action. Um,
Absolutely.
so how quickly does the word get out? Actually, before I do that, if you know this, let me know. What happens on the third, like what happens to this garrison in the fort? Um, do they remain there? Do they eventually get out of the fort? Because obviously now they know they're a target, although it sounds like Sullivan's got most of what he needs out of the fort. What happens
Yeah.
to the garrison?
The garrison pretty well, it stays status quo. They've still got basically a skeletal group of people who stay. By mid-January, they start taking depositions from everybody associated with the fort on the British side.
Hmm,
So we know that there's coming and goings between Portsmouth and the fort at that point in time. And but but again, the thing that strikes me is just strange is they don't send a boatload of reinforcements to then man the fort. It's just kind of like, oh, well, that happened. That's not great. Okay, I guess moving on. I mean, like, there's
right,
just this lack of a sense of urgency, I guess, about it. And I think that's what strikes me as just so strange about it is that you're right. It is. And it's an attack on the crown. It's an attack on
right,
King George III. How is that just like not getting the kind of response that you would expect? Because that's
right.
just very, very strange.
So what's Gage's response when he gets word of this a few days later, and when he's actually in Salem or Boston, he's back and forth between the two. But what's his response?
Oh, everybody's irate. I mean, don't get me wrong. They are absolutely confounded at the fact that this has happened. And I don't know if there's a thought of the people of New Hampshire would never go this far, or if they just really didn't see this happening. And again, there's lots of different ways that you can kind of deconstruct that and kind of get an idea. But the ending result is that people are very upset about this. News gets back to news basically spreads all over, I mean, England, Scotland, you name it. And there's newspaper writings about this. And you've got some factions who are like, wow, I can't believe that they did this. This is fantastic. And then you've got other sides that are thinking, how did this happen? How did we let this happen? So you've got two very different kind of camps that are existing there. And in terms of the British response, you know, I'd mentioned about the depositions. The depositions name just a ton of different people from, there's probably, I was able to access roughly about 10 to 15 pages of deposition transcriptions, but within those pages, there's just so many people who are listed as participants for the Patriot side of this. How they're not brought to task and brought into justice is just shocking, because the outrage is there by the British.
And yeah,
I
it's
mean, let me put it to you this way. So they dump all the tea into the harbor, and then pretty quickly you notice that the king closed the harbor. How
right.
is it possible that you storm the fort, steal everything in it, and your waterways are open? There's no major there's no retribution in that regard. That's just striking to me when you look at what happened in Boston, and then you look at what happened here. It's like, okay, did they just drop the ball? I mean, I don't understand how that happens with the British government.
Yeah, no. And it's also amazing. I wonder too, and we can kind of jump in this now, why this isn't the beginning of the war. Um, I wonder if because the British didn't fight back, or not fire a volley and kill 10 or
Yeah,
15 militiamen, that this didn't escalate, right? It was able, and maybe that was the point of the commander of the fort, was maybe he didn't want, obviously he's outnumbered, so he's thinking about his own life and the men that serve under him. But maybe this is his way of trying to diffuse this situation where, maybe if they're firing, volleys as small as they may be and killing people, that this may be the escalation, because that's what happens, obviously a few months later. Um, so we talked about this before we started recording. And there's really not a good answer for this, so I don't expect you to give me the right answer. But I'd like to hear your thoughts of why do you think this particular event isn't what starts off the war? Why isn't this what um, gets things going in a sense where we start seeing a lot more violence? Because you see things kind of calm down after this up until April. I mean, obviously there's
right.
excursions by the British Army. There's small things going on, but not something to this level. So, why do you think that is?
Um, Short answer, I don't know.
Yeah, no,
My expounded
and
answer,
that's an okay
um,
answer.
yeah, my thought is, I have to assume because there was not more bloodshed that it didn't get as much attention as it probably should have. That's the first and foremost thing that I see is an issue as to why this wasn't the shot heard around the world. Lexington and Concord, obviously, it was a bloody battle. You got both sides there. I think had Captain Cochrane and his men took a different method and actually fired upon those approaching the fort. I mean, because if you think about it, if they were on the walls of the fort and they were looking out and you can hear boats approaching with oars, and I don't care how quiet they try to wrap them and things like that many people in boats, you're going to hear something.
Sure,
If they had decided to fire upon those people, which again, that could have raised a whole bunch of other issues. Why are you firing upon people when you don't know their business? I mean, that kind of leads into other questions. But if there had been some sort of decisive move to be able to defend the fort that resulted in some sort of injury, casualties, things like that, it probably would have gotten more notoriety. But the fact that a group of people, hundreds of people, stormed the fort, took the ammunitions, took cannons, everything else, took the captain as hostage, and like nothing happened, that is absolutely shocking to me.
no,
And
I
and it
know.
does, it definitely does deserve its place in American history more than, a byline here and there. Like this was a major, major deal.
And that's a great segue. And what I'm about to ask you now is, so I guess it's a two-part question, is what drew you to this story, right? Because we're all drawn to specific stories for particular reasons. And on top of that, what do you see as the importance of this event and the timeline in early American history? So it's kind of a two-part question. They're probably a little bit connected, though, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So what initially drew me to this was studying my own family history. And I had found out that I had a patriot involved in the Pine Tree Riot in 1772. And when I went to go look for the legal records of the trial, I was completely befuddled, if you will, that there was only a 20 shilling fine for basically assaulting Crown authorities, which again seems completely, like I don't understand how that happens. And so the more and more research I took on and the more and more things I was looking at, it just seemed like there was a legal leniency that was existing in the colonies, especially in New Hampshire at this time, that led to kind of this slow burn of revolt that I guess could have easily been, it could have been missed, I guess, by Wentworth and his men, just because it wasn't necessarily on top, really violent, on a regular basis. It was just this slow burn. By the time I got to understanding the relevance of like the Pine Tree Riot, the HMS Gaspee being burned, and for any of your viewers who are unfamiliar with that, Patriot crews rowed out to the ship, the HMS Gaspee, burned the ship, shot the captain, took the crew hostage, and everybody in Providence, Rhode Island, did not give up who it was, and everybody knew who it was. It was this whole group of people who met actually in the next room from a bunch of judges, which again is interesting. Um, but when you look at the fact that there's no repercussions on some of these things, and then you study about Fort William and Mary and the seizure of it, and the lack of repercussion, I guess, it's just shocking to me because oftentimes I think when we're studying about the Revolutionary War, it's oh, okay, it was this battle, and then of course there's it led to this and this, and you can kind of see you can see a lineage there. With a couple of these events, it's completely confusing, really, as to why, one, how did it not get more attention? And two, how is this not put forth in the courts and actually brought to justice? Because if you have the names of the depositions and you have all of these responsible parties, did they just decide not to? I mean, I've read some things to where Governor Wentworth thought that he didn't have enough support within the colony to actually bring charges. But if you brought charges, would that have actually stemmed any more resistance? I mean, that's, it's obviously it starts getting into, a little bit more of criminal justice, but, there's a lot of questions that it opens up that are really important to this era, especially before Lexington and Concord, because it gives you a clear foundation of what was going on and how the lack of repercussions for some of these things, whether it's a riot or a burning ship, well, if they're not being prosecuted for those things, let's row out to the fort and take what we want, then it's
Right.
ours, right? I mean, like you can kind of start seeing how the justification is there for it. So I think it's a really important topic to be able to study.
And I think a little bit, but I think it emboldens the leaders in Boston, right?
Yes.
Emboldens Warren, emboldens Hancock, emboldens Adams to just keep pushing that envelope a little bit more and more, right?
Yeah.
Like this event happens in Portsmouth, and nothing really came of it from the British side. So I think it gives the Whigs, the Patriots, a little bit um, more opportunity to be a little bit more daring, a little bit more, open about their resistance.
Absolutely.
And you make a great, talk about the Gatsby and the Pine Riot, that's all. I mean, I didn't even think about that, right? So that just tells you a little bit more about what's going on in New Hampshire and New England about these things that are occurring that the British officials really aren't enforcing the law on. Um, if you let them go
That's
free.
yeah. That's probably the biggest thing that I see is this lack of any kind of legal recourse in the court system. Because, if you're trying to stem the tide of revolt and rioting and all of these other things, theft even, you know, well, then you need to enforce the laws that are there. Well, if you're not enforcing the laws, not only are you going to embolden people, like you had mentioned, you're really giving them a license to have all of these other, whether it's, storming the fort, because that idea that those ammunitions and those cannons and things were theirs in the people of New Hampshire, that's a really critical part to it. Because if you feel like something is yours, do you really need to then get permission to go get it if it's yours? I mean, that's a question that could
Right.
be, you could analyze that all day long, I'm sure. But
And we see too, like taking of powder, um, the militia groups, the patriot groups, these different committees, taking of powder is one thing. You can claim self-defense with powder. But when you start
sure,
seeing them steal cannon, not just from Fort William and Mary, but the four guns that are stolen out of Boston under
right.
Gage's nose. Those are not weapons you're trying to defend from Indian frontier attacks, right? Those are almost offensive weapons that takes it
Yeah,
to a level. And I think, what happens up there in William and Mary taking these cannon and what happens in Boston taking those four cannon really scares Gage a lot. Like I think
yeah,
and I think at that point is probably when he and maybe this happens in New Hampshire too. They're like, the court system isn't going to help us. This needs to be almost like a militarized situation
Yeah.
for so
I
long.
mean, and when you think of even the failure of like the Admiralty Court in the HMS Gaspee incident, I mean, if the Admiralty Court isn't even able to do anything and
Right.
they're not able to get anywhere with it, then why would you think that the normal court system, the state's courts, colony courts, are going to be able to do anything either?
Right.
Because there's a lot more leeway there with the Admiralty courts than otherwise. And I think that
When-
the fact that they're stealing can I mean, and for those who don't know, usually it's an imprint of, King George's, the symbols of the crown are on those cannons. To
Sure.
steal something that is so boldly the crown's goods, that says a lot. That is a very defiant move.
No, yeah, it is. That's why it's fascinating to read about this. So, for those listening or watching, I know there's not a lot written about this, but where would you recommend people going to learn a little bit more, whether it's a place to visit or a book to read or an article to read? Um, what are your recommendations? There's so little about this out there, but I think other people will find this really fascinating as well. So, where would you recommend people try to go get more information?
Well, if you have the ability, go to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Portsmouth Athenaeum is a small independent museum, and they have got so much. For my research, they were just, indispensable in terms of the access that they had, depositions, letters, all sorts of different kinds of correspondence. But being in Portsmouth, seeing the Langdon House, just seeing the proximity to some of these things, in terms of where the town is from the fort. And unfortunately, the fort right now is undergoing renovations, but hopefully it will be open in the near future. But you can at least, it gives you a real sense of what was going on. Because if you picture December 13th, 14th, 15th, that time frame at night, rowing out to the water, it just gives you a completely different perspective of what these men were willing to do. So I think spending any kind of time in Portsmouth is definitely well worth it.
Yeah, and they're doing a lot of, for those who are watching, listening before December 13th, 2024. If you get a chance to go up there, they're doing a lot of different events for the 250th of this. As you mentioned, the site of the fort's closed. It's still owned by I don't know if it's Army or Navy, but still a military base. And when I went up there, it was hard to get on. I was able to get up there and take some pictures, but now it's closed. So they can't actually do the anniversary events at the site, but I know they have a lot of events planned. So
Yeah,
we always try to, promote all these events that are going on because I think it helps spread the word that these things are important and the places are important, right? I mean, you could read about these
yeah,
in the book, but going to them, as you just mentioned, you made a great point. Being there, seeing the lay of the land, see the proximity of all this stuff is so important to understand what happened.
yeah.
Um,
And the park, where they're doing a lot of the reenactment for, this upcoming weekend, that's where they're meeting and they're doing all of these events there. Well, that park was exactly where, you know, Chief Justice Theodore Atkinson is yelling, "You all are committing treason against the crown,"
right.
and it's like, okay, I can picture this, like you're actually getting an idea of, Governor Wentworth not being too far away and his right-hand man yelling, "You're committing treason," and it brings it all to life in a way that, just reading it doesn't necessarily do. So I absolutely encourage people to go, if they're able to make the visit, it's so
Yeah.
well worth it.
Yeah, if you can't do it for the events, do it at some point. I was glad I was able to do it a couple years ago. If you're going in December, bundle up. I'm sorry,
Yes.
I'm
Yeah.
born and raised in Virginia. It's cold today. It's like 40. I'm freezing. So,
Yeah.
but
I
it's
understand.
definitely a pretty area too. Not very far from Boston, so you can do a lot of different sites that are related to the beginning of the American Revolution, just in close proximity. So my last question is for you. So, what kind of future research and writing projects are you working on? Anything that's upcoming for you that you like to talk about?
Yeah, I'm working on a manuscript actually about Fort William and Mary, which
Fantastic.
it's encompassing a lot of that legal framework of the pre-revolutionary era, roughly about 1770 to 1774. focusing on New Hampshire and Rhode Island specifically. And I will be speaking at the history camp in August
Oh, cool.
about Fort William and Mary.
That's great. And, I know it takes a while to get manuscripts out, but when it gets out, let us know. We'll definitely be able to
Absolutely.
help promote that to people because, again, there's very little, as you know, out there about these events. So, the more the better, the more we get to read, the more we get to understand these events. So, well, hey, well, thank you, Dr. Hatch, for joining us. Thank you for those who are listening and watching. Like I said, please go out and promote these sites and learn more about this event. I do think this is one of the bigger events between the Tea Party and April 19th. Not to belittle the Salem alarm in February or the powder alarm. Those are important events too. But I just think that this story is so amazing that you actually have King's troops under fire and, well, not under fire, but under attack. And the war doesn't start there, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And if you think about it. So thank you, Dr. Hatch, for joining us. Thank you all for watching. Stay tuned. We'll be back in 2 more weeks for our next podcast and take care.
All right. Thank you.